The night was as dark as pitch, and the relentless rain drummed against the windshield of James's grandmother's old car. The wind howled like a pack of wolves in the distance, adding an eerie soundtrack to his lonely journey. He had no particular destination in mind, just the need to escape the pressures of life for a while and clear his head. The headlights cut through the rain, illuminating the road ahead in a narrow beam of light. The world outside the car was obscured, shrouded in darkness and mystery. James's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he navigated the winding, desolate highway. Miles passed, and James was beginning to feel a growing unease. The isolation of the road was oppressive, and the rhythmic drumming of the rain was hypnotic. He tried to shake off his discomfort by turning up the radio, but the staticky reception only added to his growing sense of isolation. The old car's engine hummed as James continued to drive, the only soul on this seemingly endless stretch of highway. He couldn't help but wonder why no one else was out on the road tonight. The weather was terrible, but surely there should have been at least a few other brave or foolish souls on the highway. James's thoughts were interrupted when he noticed a faint, flickering light in the distance. Squinting through the rain-smeared windshield, he strained to make out what it was. As he got closer, the source of the light became clearer, a dimly lit roadside diner. Relief washed over him. He could use a break from the relentless rain, and a hot cup of coffee sounded like just the thing to ward off the chill that had settled into his bones. He pulled into the gravel parking lot, the sound of the rain hitting the car suddenly muffled as he shut off the engine. The diner's neon sign buzzed with a soft, eerie glow that seemed to cast long shadows in every direction. James stepped out of the car and was immediately soaked by the rain. He dashed for the door, which swung open with a loud creak as he entered. The diner was nearly empty, save for a few patrons huddled in booths and at the counter. The lighting inside was dim, and the air was thick with the smell of frying bacon and coffee. A bell above the door jingled as James entered, and the few heads that turned to look at him quickly returned to their meals. James took a seat at the counter, and a middle-aged waitress with tired eyes and a name tag that read Dottie came over. Her voice was a raspy whisper as she asked, "What'll it be, hon?" "Coffee, please," James replied, his voice sounding louder than he intended in the quiet diner. Dottie poured him a steaming cup of coffee and left the pot on the counter. James took a sip, relishing the warmth that spread through his chest. He glanced around the diner, noticing that the other patrons seemed lost in their own thoughts, their faces illuminated by the dim, flickering lights. As he sat there, sipping his coffee, James couldn't help but eavesdrop on the low murmur of conversations around him. The words were mostly unintelligible, a jumble of voices and whispers that seemed to blend together into a strange, unsettling cacophony. He strained to make out snippets of conversation, but it was as if the words themselves were resisting comprehension. A feeling of unease crept over James once again, and he found himself wondering if this place was as deserted as it seemed. The other patrons all had a strange, distant look in their eyes, as if they were here but not quite here. He tried to catch the eye of the man sitting next to him at the counter, but the man stared straight ahead, his coffee untouched. James decided to break the silence. "Is it always this quiet here?" Dottie, who had been wiping down the counter, paused and looked at him with a weary smile. "Oh, hon, this place has seen better days. Ever since they built that new highway a few miles over, we don't get as much traffic as we used to." James nodded, but her explanation didn't quite sit right with him. There was something about this diner, something that made his skin crawl. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he knew he didn't want to linger here any longer than necessary. Finishing his coffee, James paid his bill and headed back out into the rain. He got back into his car and continued his journey, the feeling of unease still gnawing at him. As he pulled back onto the highway, he couldn't shake the sensation that the diner and its strange patrons were somehow connected to the desolation of this night. The rain showed no sign of letting up, and the road ahead stretched on endlessly. James tried to push the strange encounter out of his mind, focusing on the road and the rhythmic thud of the windshield wipers. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Hours passed, and James's fatigue began to set in. He had been driving for what felt like an eternity, and the monotonous rhythm of the rain on the roof was lulling him into a drowsy stupor. He knew he needed to find a place to rest, but there were no signs for motels or rest stops, just the endless highway. Just as he was about to resign himself to driving through the night, he spotted another sign of life on the roadside, a small, dilapidated motel with a flickering neon vacancy sign. It seemed like a welcome oasis in the darkness, and James pulled into the gravel parking lot with a sigh of relief. The motel's office was a small, dimly lit room with a bell on the counter. James rang the bell, and a tired-looking woman in her 40s appeared from a back room. Her hair was disheveled, and her eyes were heavy with exhaustion. "Can I help you?" she asked in a weary voice. "I'd like a room for the night, please," James replied. The woman nodded and handed him a key. "Room 12, right down the hall. Cash only, and no refunds." James paid and made his way to room 12. The motel was in a state of disrepair, with peeling wallpaper and a musty smell that permeated the air. He didn't care, though. All he wanted was a bed to rest his weary head. Inside the room, James flicked on the dim overhead light and took a moment to survey his surroundings. The bed looked lumpy and uncomfortable, but he didn't mind. He was too exhausted to be picky. He stripped off his wet clothes, hung them up to dry, and crawled under the scratchy blankets. As he lay there, the rain continued to drum against the window, providing a soothing backdrop to his thoughts. James was on the verge of falling asleep when he heard it, a soft, distant whisper that sent a shiver down his spine. It was a voice, barely audible, as if it were coming from somewhere far away. He strained to listen, but the words were indecipherable, just a faint, eerie murmur that seemed to dance at the edge of his consciousness. He sat up in bed, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice seemed to be coming from the room next door. James debated whether to investigate, but something told him it was a bad idea. He had a feeling he was not alone in this motel, and the idea of confronting whatever was on the other side of the thin, grimy wall filled him with dread. But curiosity got the better of him, and he couldn't ignore the whisper any longer. He got out of bed and cautiously approached the wall, pressing his ear against it to listen. The voice was clearer now, but still maddeningly unintelligible. He was about to give up when he heard his own name, James. It was faint, barely audible, but there was no mistaking it. Someone in the next room was whispering his name. Fear and confusion coursed through James's veins as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Who could possibly know his name in this desolate place? And why were they whispering it like some dark incantation? James pulled away from the wall, his heart racing. He had to confront this. He had to find out who was in the next room and what they wanted. Clad only in his boxers, he quietly opened the door and stepped out into the dimly lit corridor. The motel hallway was eerily quiet, and the only sound was the faint patter of rain against the windows. James made his way to the door of the room next to his, room 11. The door was slightly ajar, and a thin sliver of light spilled out into the hallway. James pushed the door open slowly, his breath caught in his throat. The room was bathed in an otherworldly glow, the source of which was not immediately clear. But as James's eyes adjusted, he saw her, a woman, sitting at the edge of the bed. She was beautiful, with long, dark hair that cascaded down her shoulders like a waterfall. Her eyes were a deep, penetrating green, and her skin was pale as moonlight. But there was something undeniably eerie about her, a haunting quality that sent a chill down James's spine. She turned to look at him, her lips parting in a smile that sent shivers down his spine. "James," she whispered, her voice soft and melodic. "How do you know my name?" James stammered, his heart pounding in his chest. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she rose from the bed and glided toward him, her movements almost ethereal. She reached out a hand, her fingers trailing over his skin like a gentle caress. James's fear and fascination battled within him. He should have run, should have screamed, but he found himself unable to resist her pull. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed against hers. The moment their skin touched, a surge of images and emotions flooded James's mind. He saw flashes of the past, a long-forgotten childhood memory, a lost love, moments of happiness and sorrow. It was as if the woman was peering into his very soul. "You carry so much with you, James," she whispered, her voice filled with sorrow. "So much pain and regret." James tried to pull away, to break the connection, but he couldn't. It was as if he were trapped in a web of her making, unable to escape. The woman's eyes bore into his, and suddenly, he understood. She was not just a woman, she was a ghost, a restless spirit trapped in this forsaken place. She had reached out to him, drawn to his presence, and now she sought to share in his memories and emotions. As the minutes ticked by, James felt his own life force draining away. He was growing weaker, his memories slipping away like sand through his fingers. He knew that if he stayed here any longer, he would become nothing more than a shell, a vessel for the woman's own torment. With a last burst of strength, James wrenched himself free from her grasp and stumbled back into the hallway. He slammed the door shut behind him, his heart pounding in his chest. The hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly in both directions, and he didn't know where to go or what to do. But one thing was clear, he had to get out of this motel, out of this nightmarish place. He ran down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the silence, and burst out into the rain-soaked night. The rain was coming down harder than ever, drenching him to the bone as he sprinted for his car. He didn't care about the storm, all he wanted was to escape this haunted motel and the ghostly woman who had nearly consumed his soul. James jumped into the car, fumbling with the keys as he tried to start the engine. The car roared to life, and he slammed his foot on the gas pedal, tearing out of the motel parking lot with tires screeching. As he drove away, he stole one last glance at the motel in his rearview mirror. The neon vacancy sign flickered and sputtered, casting eerie shadows on the building. And in one of the windows, he saw her, the ghostly woman, her green eyes locked onto his, a mournful expression on her face. James drove for hours, putting as much distance as he could between himself and that forsaken motel. The rain eventually began to subside, and the first rays of dawn broke through the horizon. He pulled over at a gas station, his hands still trembling from the encounter. As he stood in the fluorescent-lit convenience store, he realized that he had lost something that night more than just his sense of safety. The memories and emotions that the ghost had taken from him were gone, leaving him with a hollow feeling of emptiness. But he was alive, and that was enough for now. He had survived a nightmarish encounter on a desolate highway, and he would carry the memory of it with him forever. The road ahead was long, and he didn't know where it would lead, but one thing was certain: he would never forget the haunting highway and the ghostly woman who had tried to claim him as her own. The moon hung low in the night sky, casting eerie shadows through the dense, ancient trees that lined the forest road. For years, this stretch of winding, unpaved road had been shrouded in mystery and dread, stories of strange happenings and unsettling encounters whispered among the locals. Sarah had heard the tales, but she didn't believe in superstitions or ghost stories. She was an adventurous spirit, and she reveled in the thrill of the unknown. So, when she found herself in a small town surrounded by dense woods, she saw it as the perfect opportunity for a late-night drive. Her car's headlights sliced through the inky darkness, illuminating the narrow path ahead. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and the forest seemed to close in around her as she drove deeper into its depths. Sarah's heart raced with excitement, her sense of adventure growing stronger with every mile. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, the ancient trees looming like silent sentinels on either side. But as she continued, Sarah began to notice peculiar things, a flicker of movement at the edge of her vision, strange shadows that danced just beyond the reach of her headlights. She dismissed them as tricks of the mind, a result of her overactive imagination. Then, as she rounded a particularly sharp bend, her headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. Sarah slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car came to a sudden halt. She squinted through the windshield, trying to make out the figure ahead. It was a woman, her long, tangled hair blowing in the gentle night breeze. She wore a tattered white dress that billowed around her like a ghostly shroud. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the woman slowly approach the car. "Are you okay?" Sarah called out, her voice trembling. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she continued to advance, her eyes fixed on Sarah with an unsettling intensity. The air grew colder, and Sarah could see her breath in the dim glow of her car's interior lights. A sudden chill ran down Sarah's spine, and she knew that something was terribly wrong. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers shaking as she tried to dial for help. But as she glanced up, she saw that the woman was no longer in front of the car. Panicked, Sarah scanned the darkness outside. The woman had vanished, as if she had never been there at all. Sarah's heart raced as she considered her options. She could turn back and flee the forest road, but a stubborn curiosity tugged at her. With trembling hands, Sarah put the car in gear and continued down the road, determined to uncover the mystery of the woman in white. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees growing taller and more twisted as she drove deeper into the woods. As she rounded another bend, the headlights illuminated a dilapidated, long-abandoned cabin on the side of the road. Sarah brought the car to a stop, her eyes fixed on the eerie structure. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed the cabin whole, leaving it to rot in solitude. A soft, mournful wail carried on the wind, sending shivers down Sarah's spine. She hesitated for a moment, debating whether to investigate further, but her curiosity got the better of her. She stepped out of the car and cautiously approached the cabin. The air around the cabin was heavy with a sense of foreboding. Sarah pushed open the creaking door, revealing a dark interior filled with shadows. She took a deep breath and stepped inside, her footsteps echoing on the dusty wooden floor. The interior of the cabin was frozen in time, as if its occupants had abruptly vanished, leaving behind the remnants of their lives. Dust-covered furniture lay strewn about, cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and a layer of decay coated everything. Sarah's flashlight revealed faded photographs on the walls, depicting a family that had once lived here. She couldn't help but feel a deep sense of sadness and loss as she studied their faces. It was as if the spirits of the past still lingered in this desolate place. As she moved deeper into the cabin, Sarah heard the faint sound of whispering. It was a chorus of voices, hushed and indistinct, emanating from the shadows. She strained to listen, but the words remained elusive. Then, as she entered a small, dimly lit bedroom, Sarah's flashlight beam fell upon a tattered diary lying on an old, decrepit bed. She picked it up and began to read, the words recounting the tragic tale of a family that had once lived in the cabin. The diary spoke of a curse that had befallen them, a curse tied to the forest itself. It told of strange occurrences, of voices in the night, and of a woman in white who appeared on the forest road, beckoning to them. The family had become trapped, unable to leave the cabin, their lives slowly consumed by the malevolent spirits of the forest. As Sarah read, the whispers grew louder, the voices of the trapped souls seeming to surround her. She knew she had to leave, that she had to escape the cabin and the forest before it was too late. But as she turned to go, she was confronted by the ghostly figure of the woman in white, standing in the doorway. The woman's eyes bore into Sarah's, and with a voice like a mournful lament, she spoke, "You must stay with us, dear. You must become a part of the forest." Terrified, Sarah turned and ran, fleeing the cabin and the haunting figure that pursued her. She raced back to her car, her heart pounding in her chest as she sped away from the forest road. As she left the woods behind, the oppressive darkness gave way to the soft light of dawn. Sarah's hands trembled as she realized that she had narrowly escaped the clutches of the forest's malevolent spirits. She would never forget the haunted forest road and the chilling encounter with the woman in white. It was a night that would forever haunt her dreams, a night when the boundary between the living and the dead had blurred, and the supernatural had become all too real. The night was cloaked in an oppressive darkness as Mark's car crept along the winding, overgrown road leading to the abandoned asylum. The moon hid behind thick clouds, casting ominous shadows across the decaying structure. The very mention of this place had always sent shivers down his spine, but tonight, fueled by bravado and curiosity, he had decided to confront his fears. The asylum had been closed for decades, a place where the mentally ill were once confined and forgotten. Stories of cruelty and suffering had swirled around it like a toxic fog, and it had earned a sinister reputation as a haunted house. Mark had never believed in ghosts or the supernatural, but the eerie tales had always intrigued him. As he parked his car and stepped out into the chilly night, the wind whispered through the skeletal trees, and the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth. The asylum loomed before him, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti. Broken glass crunched under his boots as he approached the main entrance. The door, half hanging off its hinges, creaked open with a spine-tingling groan. Mark's flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing the asylum's dilapidated interior. Crumbled ceiling tiles littered the floor, and the walls were decorated with graffiti, creating an unsettling fusion of art and decay. Every step he took seemed to echo through the abandoned halls, amplifying the silence that clung to the building like a suffocating shroud. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he ventured deeper, drawn to the asylum's darkest secrets. As he explored the asylum's labyrinthine corridors, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Shadows seemed to dance just out of the reach of his flashlight, and strange noises echoed from hidden corners. But he pressed on, determined to prove that the stories were nothing more than urban legends. The asylum was a maze of locked doors and forgotten rooms, each one holding the secrets of the past. In one room, he discovered rusted restraints, a chilling reminder of the asylum's grim history. In another, he stumbled upon a pile of discarded patient records, their tales of torment and despair written in fading ink. Mark's sense of unease grew with each discovery, but he couldn't turn back now. He had to see it through, to reach the heart of the asylum and confront whatever mysteries it held. Finally, he reached the asylum's basement, a place rumored to be the epicenter of its haunting. The air grew even colder, and a dank, earthy smell filled his nostrils. His flashlight flickered, casting eerie, stuttering shadows on the walls. As Mark descended the creaking staircase, he heard a faint, mournful wail, a sound that sent a shiver down his spine. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and moved forward, determined to uncover the source of the sound. In the basement, Mark's flashlight beam fell upon a rusted, iron door. It stood slightly ajar, as if beckoning him to enter. With a sense of trepidation, he pushed the door open, revealing a room bathed in an eerie, bluish light. Inside, he saw her, a woman, her pale, gaunt face illuminated by an otherworldly glow. She was dressed in a tattered, blood-stained gown, her hair matted and tangled. Her eyes were empty, devoid of life, and yet they seemed to bore into Mark's soul. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, her voice a haunting echo. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the spectral figure. He couldn't move, couldn't tear his eyes away from her ghostly form. The woman floated closer, her gaze never leaving his. "This place is cursed," she continued. "The suffering, the anguish, it lingers here, trapped between worlds." A sudden, bone-chilling gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing Mark's flashlight. In the pitch darkness, he felt a cold, clammy hand close around his wrist. Panic surged through him as he struggled to break free. The woman's voice grew louder, a chorus of tortured souls joining in her lament. Mark felt an overwhelming sense of dread as he realized that he was not alone. The asylum was filled with the restless spirits of the past, all drawn to his presence, all seeking release from their torment. With all his strength, Mark wrenched himself free from the spectral grip and stumbled back toward the iron door. He fumbled for his phone, desperately trying to find a source of light. As the eerie wails of the spirits echoed around him, he managed to illuminate the room with the phone's weak glow. The woman in the tattered gown had drawn closer, her mournful gaze never leaving him. Mark's heart raced as he pushed through the iron door and fled the basement, the anguished cries of the spirits echoing in his ears. He stumbled up the stairs and burst out of the asylum, gasping for breath as he emerged into the night. The moon had broken free from the clouds, casting its cold light on the forsaken building. Mark never returned to the abandoned asylum, his belief in the supernatural forever shattered. The haunting memories of that night would stay with him, a chilling reminder that some mysteries were best left unsolved. The asylum would continue to stand, its dark secrets hidden behind its decaying walls, a place where the living and the dead converged in a nightmarish dance of torment and despair.